It was one of the greatest civil rights movements in Canadian history, is how I'd call it.
I was at a book signing with Trish Wood and Ray McGinnis a week and a half ago. And in the audience was a woman from the UK. She's back and forth between Canada and the UK quite often. And she said from the UK, she was just glued to her TV,
Yeah,
watching everything that she could
yeah,
about the convoy. And so we knew during the convoy itself that we were actually sort of, for lack of a better term, setting the standard
yeah,
on what you could do to push back against your government. I mean, trucks make wonderful obstacles
yeah, yeah.
when you're in a great place to sleep in minus 35,
Right, right.
provided the police don't steal your fuel.
So much has happened in the United States and Canada in the last 6 months politically that thinking back to the pandemic and the lockdowns and the trucker convoy almost feels like a different age, a different era. And indeed, I think it was. It's my view that the invocation of the Emergencies Act marks the beginning of the downfall of Justin Trudeau in two ways. First of all, I think it revealed his tyrannical side. And second of all, those same events caused the defenestration of Erin O'Toole as the Conservative Party leader, replacing him with a much more vigorous Pierre Poilievre. If you can believe it, it was 3 years ago today that Justin Trudeau panicked. Panicked not for security reasons, but for political reasons. Panicked because the world was watching how ordinary truckers, grassroots people of all backgrounds, genuinely authentic and organic, caused the government of Canada to blink. It was an amazing and terrifying time, a terrible decision that was later found to be illegal and unconstitutional by the Federal Court of Canada. But as you'll recall, living through it, it was unknown how deep Canada would go down the road to a police state. And indeed, it was for several days a police state, seizing hundreds of people's bank accounts, arresting people willy-nilly. It was a return to the bad old days. At least Pierre Trudeau, when he invoked the War Measures Act, he could point to a bona fide terrorist group, the FLQ, which was blowing up mailboxes with bombs, kidnapping people, and in fact, murdered one. Justin Trudeau, he was just embarrassed on Twitter. Joining us now to talk about that fateful time, the trucker convoy, the Emergencies Act, and the resilience of the Canadian people who helped throw off the government that it is in its final days. I'm joined now by Tom Marazzo, whose latest project is the president of the Ontario Party. Tom, how are you doing? Nice to see you again. We talked more back in the
Yeah.
day during the lockdowns, during the convoy. It's nice to see you again.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, especially on the third anniversary of the EA.
Yeah, it's amazing how time flies. That matter is still working its way through the courts. Of course, the federal government lost the constitutional challenge, and they're appealing that. And
Mhm.
as you know, there are some people, including Tamara Leach, who you know well, who are
Mhm.
still working through the courts, being prosecuted for pandemic lockdowns 3+ years later. Are you under any prosecution or any legal or political intervention based on
I,
what happened 3 years ago?
yeah, I was never charged criminally. There was no warrants or anything like that. But I am one of the 40 or so that are named on, I don't know what it's at by now, $300 million lawsuit that was filed with the attorney in Ottawa, Paul
Oh,
Champ,
right,
Zexi Lee, and the Happy Goat something coffee
right,
company.
right.
So that's the only legal action against me. I have filed in court. I am suing the federal government for freezing my bank accounts
Oh, right,
without any form of due process, whatever whatsoever. And I'm
right,
represented by Brendan Miller, Eva Chipiuk, and Keith Wilson
right.
on that lawsuit. But in terms of my own personal charges, I've never had a warrant for my arrest. I was never charged. I was never convicted of anything. And it's a mystery to anybody why I even ended up on Tamara Leach's no contact
Right,
list.
right.
But that's the liberal control over the court system right now in Ottawa.
Well, we learned through the Public Order Inquiry Commission, sort of it was a largely stage managed affair with a hand-picked judge with a handwritten mandate from Trudeau. But I think we did
Mhm.
learn a lot from it nonetheless, including how disorganized the police were. It was a comedy of errors. I mean, it really felt like a Benny Hill sketch or Keystone Cops. Um, and that was part of it. It was so capricious, so whimsical,
Mhm.
and you had sort of blowhard police chiefs who were just sort of making it up as they went along. I'm frankly surprised they didn't make a move on Rebel News because although we didn't
Mhm.
give money to truckers directly, we were journalists on the ground supporting the truckers, and we crowdfunded lawyers for the truckers. I
Mhm.
was really worried that with one phone call, someone from Chrystia Freeland's office would shut down our bank account, which would have put us out of business immediately. Our staff can't work without pay.
Mhm.
Tell me what your memories were. Were you on the ground in Ottawa when the Emergencies Act came in?
Yeah, I was actually for the first time I had a chance to meet Brian Peckford, and I
Oh,
was
yeah.
sitting with Brian having a coffee. Tamara was there. I think Chris Barber was there. Brian's wife. I think Eva Chipiuk was in the room. We were having a coffee about the sort of best way to get the negotiation going with the city to try to get more trucks onto Wellington out of the downtown core, which is what we had been working towards the entire time. And that's when Keith Wilson walked into the room and said that Justin Trudeau had invoked the Emergencies Act. And so, that was pretty very surreal to be in there with the in the room with the last living member of the government that signed the
Right,
Charter of Rights and
right.
Freedoms as they're actually being stripped away from both of you together.
Wow, that's incredible. Now,
Yeah.
were you shocked by this? Did you understand what it meant when Keith Wilson said the Emergencies Act? Because I'll be candid, I didn't even really know the word. I knew the
Mhm.
War Measures Act because I knew historically Pierre Trudeau had used it. I honestly, and I think most Canadians didn't know about it because it had never been used before.
Mhm.
So I think a lot of people were quickly Googling it. Did
Yeah.
you did you know it might have been coming down? Was there a buzz that this might be coming, or were you caught completely by surprise?
Yeah, so there was a sort of this buzz about it potentially happening to us, but I viewed it as a little bit of, and I know this sounds terrible, but of little consequence, and I'll
Mm,
explain why. The city of Ottawa had already declared a state of emergency for the city, yet they had all the police powers at their disposal to deal with the protest if it had actually broken the law.
right,
Then the provincial government under Doug Ford, he had also declared a state of emergency for the province of Ontario, and again had full weight, force and effect of the criminal code system in Canada to deal with a protest had it been deemed illegal. But we knew on two occasions, Justice McLean, I think on the 7th and the 16th, had ruled twice that we had a legal right to be there to do that protest. We weren't breaking the law. All we had to do was not honk horns.
right,
We stopped honking the horns on the 7th.
right,
So we weren't even in breach of a court order to stop the horns. So it's important for people to understand that not a single Canadian right across the country was arrested under extraordinary powers of the Emergencies Act. It was symbolic, but it gave the perception to those sitting at home that, this is an unruly bunch, that the police are going to be justified to go in there and beat, citizens, seniors, veterans, with impunity because Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act. So I view the Emergencies Act really as a big smokescreen for the things that he already had the power to do. He just
right,
wanted to make it look like it was more serious and
right,
required the Emergencies Act,
right,
when in fact it didn't.
right. And even the smaller boycott in Coots, Alberta, where truckers and farmers blocked the road, if I recall, that was resolved before the
It was.
Emergencies Act was brought in. So what you're saying is, and I'm glad for this clarification, maybe I knew this, but I guess I forgot, is that the Emergencies Act did not actually cause arrests? Is that what you're saying? It's what gave the
Yeah.
green light for the money seizures, but anyone who was arrested was just arrested by a regular cop under a regular criminal code infraction. I mean,
Yes.
I am I remain furious to this day that Tamara Lich was charged with inciting mischief, but that's a regular law that's been in the criminal code and I think common law for centuries. So that they didn't need the Emergencies Act to pick her up. So it was really a shock and awe muscle flexing move, wasn't it?
Basically, yeah. I mean, everybody is they became masters after a couple of years of raising the public's anxiety level through the media.
Right.
You'd know more than I was there on the day that Candace Oro was run over by the horse.
Right.
And I remember talking to Lincoln Jay and I remember talking to Alexa Lavoie moments before she was run over by the horse.
Right.
And, so, your worry, I think was very justified given that you guys were the only real recognizable media. There was a lot of independent media, like individuals, but Rebel News was probably the most well-recognized broadcaster that was there during the actual confrontation with the police. And as you know, Alexa got shot in the leg by a projectile.
You're not going to deny me the right to look at a man.
Watch out, watch out, watch out, watch out.
What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Hold him! Yo, stop him! Stop! Stop! Keep him! Keep him! You just fired on protesters! You just fired on Hey girl, you alright? Got shot. Take care. Bring her out, come on. Bring her out. Bring the leg. Bring her down there.
And so you're right to be concerned about having your bank accounts frozen as an organization. And I'm almost surprised because they did it to Druthers.
Right.
They seized Druthers' bank accounts.
I did not know that.
$300,000.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So
I don't know if you know this, but I was so worried about it. And I thought two things would happen if our bank account was frozen. First of all, some vendors, like certain things that operate on a monthly payment from a credit card, that would go down and that might put us out of operation, like our web hosting. And then the second thing that I worried about was our staff, because I think there's a huge number of people who could not skip a paycheck. They just can't. No one's in that position. So we prepaid and we paid down all of our accounts payable. So we basically paid every vendor, and I think in some cases we may have prepaid a month. And we did so for our entire staff. We gave everyone a month's pay in advance. We said, this is not a bonus. This isn't extra. This is in case we're shut down. That was how worried I was, because we were trucker adjacent. Like you say, we were amongst them. I'm glad you remember Lincoln Jay and Alexa Lavoie. I think they worked 23 days straight without taking a break because they knew they were in the middle of history. And same in Coots. We had guys embedded in the saloon. So I don't know. I think it was whimsical. And that goes to the hodgepodge, disorganized nature of it, I think. I'm glad they didn't come for us, but I really thought they would. So here we are, 3 years later, and you have filed the action against the government, and that's based on the ruling that the Emergencies Act was illegal. That's basically the starter pistol for that, isn't it?
it really was. And, the ruling, I believe, came out a year ago in January, the Mosley decision.
Right.
And that's thanks to Eddie Cornell and Vince Gerses, who filed the judicial review. We got the ruling from Mosley. Last week, it was actually the appeal had come up, and they were arguing that the appeal,
Right.
the federal government has since then said even if they lose the appeal, they're going to go to the Supreme Court.
Right.
Well, good luck with that, given the fact that Richard Wagner, the Chief Justice, is going to have to recuse himself from any case whatsoever related to the Freedom Convoy, because, as you know, he's a judge and he spoke publicly and said a lot of disparaging things about the Freedom Convoy
Right.
as the convoy was going on. So I don't know how you can think that going to the Supreme Court of Canada is going to help you when you're down a major member, which is the Chief Justice. because I think a first-year law student, I hope, would have enough sense to say, you need to disqualify yourself. You've actually publicly biased yourself. So
Well, I hope you're right, but I mean,
yeah,
we've seen a lot of crazy things in courts in the last few years. So
yeah.
that's chugging along, and I mean, I know things move slowly. How many people are in your position? Would you estimate how many? I think there were several hundred people that had their bank accounts frozen. Are all of them suing? Are most of them suing? Do you know the others who are?
Yeah, I know of a handful of other clients that belong to Keith, Brendan, and Eva. We are all being treated as individual clients by that legal team.
Right.
And then there's another group altogether, which is Bathsheba and Ector, that are representing the group with Vince Gerses and Eddie Cornell. But as far as the other, I think there's at least I could be wrong on this number, but at least 270 people had their accounts frozen.
Right, right.
For the most minor things. I mean,
Oh,
everything from $50 donation prior to the convoy. And here's the thing that nobody really talks about. You're a lawyer, so you're familiar with the fruit of the poisonous tree.
Right.
You know, a lot of people were punished when their accounts with GoFundMe or Give Send Go were doxxed.
Were hacked.
Right. So that was an illegal act. And if you look at the police officer in Windsor, Ontario, he anonymously donated $50 to the convoy.
Right.
And then he was doxxed. And by the way, he was at home.
Yeah,
he was on leave for COVID mandates. Yeah.
We've talked to his lawyer a couple of times. Absolutely outrageous what's going on in that case.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, I travel internationally sometimes. We've sent reporters to farmer rebellions in the Netherlands and even just last week in the United Kingdom. And I've been to other protests as well. And all over the world, people talk about the Canadian truckers. I think most of the time the world sort of forgets about Canada. And I mean, but the whole world was riveted, I think, partly because it looked so authentic and organic. It was sort of a leaderless movement, which is what made it powerful and hard to stop. And it was so visually dramatic. And I think people thought, boy, those Canadians must be upset because they never get upset. Like, it was just so many wonderful things. And I'd say in Australia, in the United States, in Israel, in the Netherlands, in the UK, I mean, that's almost half a dozen countries right there. I have heard people praise the Canadian truckers. And I think that's, it was one of the greatest civil rights movements in Canadian history is how I'd call it.
I was at a book signing with Trish Wood and Ray McGuinness a week and a half ago. And in the audience was a woman from the UK. She's back and forth between Canada and the UK quite often. And she said from the UK, she was just glued to her TV, watching everything that she could about the convoy. And so we knew during the convoy itself that we were actually sort of, for lack of a better term, setting the standard on what you could do to push back against your government. I mean, trucks make wonderful obstacles. When you're in a great place to sleep in minus 35.
Right.
Provided the police don't steal your fuel.
Right. Well, it was an incredible time. And, we felt that it was a historic moment at Rebel News. And I'm glad you still remember the work done by two of our citizen journalists. In that month of February 2022, and I've told our viewers this before, we had 400 million views and impressions of Rebel News, 400 million. By contrast, the CBC state broadcaster, according to their own information, gets on average 360 million views and impressions in a month. So for that 1 month, now obviously we're not at that level now, but it was the crisis. And in the crisis, people did not trust the state broadcaster. They trusted a handful of citizen journalists just pointing their cell phones and talking to ordinary people. There were some mainstream media journalists. Rupa Subramania was one of them. But there were so few. And I think if Trudeau had his way, he would have had the January 6th insurrection narrative. He was so clearly trying to build that case, but he couldn't do it because the truckers didn't even really go anywhere. Parliament was closed for renovations. As you point out, this was not an illegal gathering. There was some traffic infractions, sure, but everyone was so Canadian. And that's what makes it wonderful. Last word to you, Tom. You look back, would you do anything differently, or was it, as I look back at it, a historic moment where people rose to the occasion?
I think the only thing that I would do again, and I wrote extensively about this book in my book, and a lot of people had mentioned.
What's your book called again?
The People's Emergency Act.
The People's Emergency Act. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And so a lot of people looked at it like it was too harsh of a criticism, but in reality, it wasn't meant to be. It was just meant to be sort of a performance review, let's say. Mm. The one thing that I would have done differently, and it's probably the only thing I can really put my finger on it, is I would have written down on a piece of paper, like what Keith Wilson drafted the final copy of the Roadmap to Freedom.
Okay.
And it outlined all the conditions that we would like to see happen and, what would make us go home and by certain dates. So basically, I don't want to use the word list of demands because that sounds ugly, but what we're about, and have that in writing before we showed up, and give it to the media, give it to the police, give it to all the people, and say, look, this is why we're here. This is our Declaration of Independence, as you will.
Right.
So this is what we're talking about. This is what we want to see happen. If these things happen, we'll be more than happy to go home. And I think that would have defended us against all the, not entirely, but against all the smearing of the government-sponsored propaganda and the lies being told by the Liberals, which they still tell the same lies over and over today.
Well, some good faith people would have been moved by such a document, but the bad guys would have lied about you no matter what. And as you point out, they're still lying. Well, I think it was an enormous victory. I think it was the greatest peaceful uprising in Canadian history, which was the appropriate remedy for the worst civil liberties bonfire in Canadian history. And Tom Marazzo, it's great to reminisce a little bit, and I've learned a few things, and you've refreshed my memory on a few things, and I wish you good luck in your lawsuit against the government.
Thank you.
I hope you're justly compensated.
Thank you.
All right, there he is, Tom Marazzo, who was there on the ground 3 years ago in Ottawa, and today he's the president of the Ontario Party. Stay with us. More ahead. Oh, hi, it's Ezra Levant here in Toronto with an important message because we need your help. Independent journalism in Canada is under attack. Government censors, big tech deplatformers, and the dying legacy media are all working together to maintain exclusive control on the information you receive. They don't want you to hear other voices like ours, and they really don't want you to be informed and to think for yourself. That's why the work we do here at Rebel News is so important. Our on-the-ground reporting, independent news shows, and special content you won't find anywhere else. It's all designed to give you trustworthy information and alternative viewpoints so you can decide for yourself. We don't get government money, and we are not owned by some big global conglomerate. We're funded by people just like you, so please support independent journalism and help us continue our work by subscribing and becoming a Rebel News Plus member today, right here on the page. Go to rebelnewsplus.com.